Hello, welcome to this introduction to cumulative cultural evolution. My name is Nicolas Claidiére and I work at the CNRS in France. During the previous lectures, you've seen that animal culture is widespread across the entire animal kingdom and that there has been many discoveries done over the last 20 years or so. In this particular lecture, we're going to be interested in the question of whether or not animal culture tends to evolve in the same way that human culture does. So I've divided this lecture into three different parts. Part one is going to be about definition and historical background. Part two about the evidence for cumulative cultural evolution in non-human animals. And part three about the origins of cumulative cultural evolution, in particular by looking at the mechanisms, the social learning mechanisms that are behind this phenomenon. So let us start with part one, definition, and some historical background. What is cumulative cultural evolution? That's the first question we really want to ask. And I think the idea is pretty straightforward. It's something that is quite intuitive and it has been around for a very long time. So for instance, if you look at this quote by Isaac Newton, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. The idea behind this quote is that no invention is the work of one person only. It's always something that is a result of the progressive accumulation of new discoveries and inventions and new ideas. And similarly, another quote that I really like is by Cicero. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain forever a child. For what is the value of a human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? And here again you find a somewhat similar idea, except that it looks very much like comparative psychology. So the idea is that human life is very special because it is based on all this knowledge that we acquire from others, all this social learning that we do all the time, this cultural information that we process. And if you completely ignore that learning and you don't learn from others, then you're going to remain forever a child, because you're not going to acquire this huge body of knowledge that has been built over many generations. So cumulative cultural evolution, if you had to define it, then the best, I think one of the best definitions is simply the following. Cumulative cultural evolution is a gradual accumulation of cultural modifications. And it's very simple, I think, and it's also very elegant. But if you look at different authors, you're going to find slightly different versions of this very basic idea. So for instance, just to give you one other example, Caldwell and Millen in 2008, the accumulation of knowledge and skills over generations, so almost the same idea. And if you want to see a full discussion of this question of how to define cumulative cultural evolution and the different criteria that you can use to identify cumulative cultural evolution, I recommend reading Messoudi and Thornton 2018, What is Cumulative Cultural Evolution? It's a very interesting paper. So what I'm going to do now is simply to sort of introduce the topic. I'm going to give you a few examples of what we mean by cumulative cultural evolution in humans. And the idea is that you have a sort of scope of what cumulative cultural evolution is about. So when you think about cumulative cultural evolution, I think the first thing that really springs to mind is technological evolution, because we're surrounded by technology and we see it evolving very, very quickly. So just to pick up an illustration of this idea that you've already seen in previous lectures, this is a picture that from Basala in 1988, and you see the evolution of hammering techniques and hammers from prehistorical times to the modern industrial revolution. And you see that these hammers tend to increase in complexity, so they become more and more complex. They also specialize, so they become directed to different purposes. And also they become, of course, more efficient, so they become more efficient at doing what they're meant to do. And this is very typical of what you find in technological evolution all over the place, from evolution of cars, of smartphones, and so on and so forth. But cumulative cultural evolution is not just about technological evolution. So here is one example, for instance, by Tyranny in 2013, looking at the evolution of the tail Little Red Riding Hood. And Tyranny studied the different versions of the tail that you can find all over Europe, Asia, and Africa. And he used phylogenetic methods to reconstruct the evolution of the tail. And what Tyranny found was that, of course, they cluster in different groups. So you can find the sort of East Asian version at the bottom left corner, and the African version on the top, and the more European version, standard European version on the right-hand side. But you see that these tails also progressively evolve and change through time, and they diverge, of course, depending on the different versions. So again, you find this idea of cumulative cultural evolution. Another interesting paper that I really like is the one by Olivier Morin in 2013, looking at the evolution of paintings and portraits in particular, looking at whether painters were painting the persons looking straight at the painter, so direct eye gaze, versus slightly averted eye gaze, which used to be more common in the older periods. So Morin studied the evolution of this shift between averted eye gaze to direct eye gaze from many different perspectives. But he gave this, I think, very telling example of the evolution of this shift during the Italian Renaissance in Venice, looking at three different painters, Bellini, Titian, and Tintoretto. And looking at paintings from the old Bellini, they're typical of this averted gaze technique, where the person is not looking at the painter. And Titian was a student of Bellini, and you see that in his younger paintings, in his earlier paintings, you see that there is roughly a 50-50% paintings, portraits with averted gaze versus direct gaze. In the older paintings from Titian, you see that the same proportion is roughly kept constant with 50% of each. Okay, so there's no change within the same painter from this early period to the later period. But Tintoretto now comes into place and is a student of Titian. And Tintoretto, we see a shift again with almost 2/3, 1/3 direct gaze versus averted gaze. So Morin argues that this shift is taking place not within painters, but between painters. So it's a change in generations that is really bringing about this change. Interestingly, Morin also described how the same shift between averted gaze to direct gaze occurred in Korea. So this seems to be a very widespread phenomenon, not typical of Italian Renaissance. Now, lastly, the last example that I really want to tell you about is by Nicolas in 2002. And Nicolas studied the evolution of norms of etiquette, so how you should really behave in society. And he's used these books, compiling norms of etiquette, to trace the evolution of norms across time. And he was interested in understanding whether emotional norms, more emotionally involved norms, were evolving differently. And he found that these norms tended to evolve only in one direction without ever reverting back to the original version. So I'm just going to give you one example that is about disgust. So first, in the 15th century, do not spit into the basin when you wash your hands, but beside it. In the 16th century, turn away when spitting, lest your saliva fall on someone. If anything purulent falls on the ground, it should be trodden upon, lest it nauseate someone. 17th century, formerly it was permitted to spit on the ground before people of rank, and was sufficient to put one's foot on the sputum. Today, that is an indecency. Number 4, 18th century, when you are with well-born people and when you are in places that are kept clean, it is polite to spit into your handkerchief while turning slightly aside. And finally, in the 19th century, spitting is at all times a disgusting habit. I need say nothing more than never indulge in it. So here again, we find the same general idea that you have a progressive evolution, the accumulation of cultural modification. And this is taking place over a very long time. So let me quickly summarize part one. So we found that cumulative cultural evolution is a gradual accumulation of cultural modification. I think that's the broadest definition we can find. And culture is made of ideas, such as norms, the idea of democracy, the idea of love, and so on and so forth. Behaviors, such as telling stories, playing football, and so on and so forth. And objects, such as paintings, hammers, etc. And finally, what we found is that in humans, cumulative cultural evolution is widespread. You find it in all the different domains, and it's extremely frequent, if not omnipresent. So the question we are going to ask is, cumulative cultural evolution also common in non-human animals? And in 1996, Boyd and Richardson concluded their paper, Why Culture is Common but Cultural Evolution is Rare, by the following sentence. There are only a few well-documented cases in which cultural change accumulates over many generations, leading to the evolution of behaviors that no individual could invent. The only well-documented examples are some dialects in birds, perhaps some behaviors in chimpanzees, and of course, many aspects of human behavior. And of course, over the last 20 years, there has been a huge effort in research to try to study non-human animal culture, as you've seen, and there has been many discoveries. So the question is this conclusion still accurate, or have we found new things that are going to mitigate this conclusion? That's going to be developed in part 2.